All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. I'm happy to be joined today by the presidential nominee of the Libertarian Party, Jo Jorgensen, who comes to us at this moment from Alaska, where she is currently campaigning. Jo, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, it's an honor. Thanks for having me. And yes, if I look to this, if I go to the side, you can see the mountain in the background. So great. It's a beautiful country up here.
Before I get started in this interview, I have to make a rare acknowledgement. In fact, I don't think I've ever said this on this program before, which is that I'm talking to someone who I actually voted for as a delegate.
Oh, really? In '96?
As a Libertarian delegate to the convention this year. I actually voted for you.
Yes.
And
so yeah, I was going to say, you didn't look old enough to vote for me in '96.
Well, that's very nice of you to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, geez, you look great for your age, but you know what?
I look terrible.
That, and I forgot. Thank you. Thank you for giving me my current job. I really appreciate it. And I hope you are good with the person that you hired.
Well, what I will say is that means I probably know a little bit more about you than most of our listeners do. Maybe tell people a little bit of background about where you came from, your interest in politics, and why you even decided to run for this job in the first place.
Oh, sure. A lot of people ask me, so I guess you must have been student body president, or you ran for student council or something like that. And I kind of bristle at that. It's like, no, I was really influenced by the book Animal Farm. And when I got to high school and I saw that an elite few group of people got to make decisions for the rest of us, I was actually quite offended. And it never occurred to me to run for student council. And I had no interest in politics until I just saw what was going on in the country. And I view voting Libertarian as an act of self-defense, that it's not a matter of the power grab, it's a matter of getting rid of that power grab.
You know, the thing that I think would be interesting to some people to hear is your approach to politics as someone who is, fundamentally an outsider. How do you go about doing this? I mean, in the contest of selections, this time around for Libertarians, it was very different than last time around, where they decided to go with two experienced politicians, but maybe people who people had some frustrations with, given the way that they approached arguing for libertarian values. Why does an outsider approach work better at this point in time?
Well, I would say it worked for Donald Trump. He came in saying, hey, I'm an outsider. I'm not a politician. I'm a businessman. And by the way, being a businessman, I know how to balance a budget. I know how to reduce spending. I know how to get things done. And he's actually done none of those, as well as bringing the troops home. So I would say that I would hope that would give most Republicans the data that they need, that if somebody like, and by the way, I do think that he was an outsider to politics in that he had never been in office. He didn't have 50 years of political favors to repay, becoming state house rep and congressman and so forth, although he has, kind of worked the system well in New York. But the fact that an outsider can parachute in as president, never having held office, and yet still increases the debt, still increases deficit spending, still can't bring the troops home, that shows that pretty much there is no hope left for the Republican Party, which of course, we longtime party members have felt that since Nixon, but now I hope it's becoming clear to the rest of the country. So anybody who voted for Donald Trump for all those reasons, I would say, now that you have your voter registration card, now that you dusted it off, since many of you hadn't voted in 20 years, now that you're ready to vote, please vote for me in November, because I'm what you really wanted last time.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about your life and story. What do you do when you're not doing politics?
Well, I'm a teacher. And in fact, people have asked me, are you sure you could handle Trump on the debate stage? And my answer is, I've handled problem students before. And of course, that would go for Joe Biden as well. So I am a senior lecturer at Clemson University. I've got a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. I also have an MBA, and I've been a small business person. I have owned a couple of small businesses in the past, of course, one of them being in computers, since I am a libertarian. and grew up north of Chicago, went down to Texas to go to school, Baylor and SMU, and then made my way to South Carolina, and that's where I got my PhD, and that's currently where I teach.
You, before I go any further, what's your opinion on college football starting back up, which is something that, has been hotly debated in different areas around the country? I know that there are a lot of Clemson fans who have strong opinions about that.
Oh, yes. And I agree with our star quarterback who has pointed out, the training facilities, they've got doctors there, they're out there on the practice field, they're working hard. Would you rather have them there, or do you want them cooped up in dorms watching video games, doing even less social distancing with fewer medical practices? And, this is just one area that the government has really failed in the whole coronavirus. And of course, as a libertarian, I think we should each make our own choice. And what frustrates me the most is this is a great example. So many times people think that if the federal government doesn't do it, it won't get done. And it's like, well, we're not smart enough to wear masks. Well, I would like to say that Walmart proved you wrong on that, what I would like to see is complete freedom where we get to vote with our feet or vote with our dollars. So if you want to wear a mask and you want other people to be wearing a mask because you're vulnerable or just for whatever reason, any reason you want, it doesn't matter, you can shop at Walmart. If you don't want to wear a mask, then you can shop somewhere else and let people make their own decisions.
There's a natural tendency during times of global pandemic historically for authoritarianism to become kind of the nature of the day, whether from right or from left. And that has a lot of appeal to people who are, I guess, used to those ideas of government getting things done. Contrast for me a little bit, though, if you will, the differences between, what you're seeing as you're going around the country and the way that people are handling this in different regions. We hear from the media contrasting, the choices that are made in a state like South Dakota with the choices made in a state like New York, for instance. And they hold up New York as being like, oh, this, the authoritarian way, the Andrew Cuomo way is kind of the good approach. But we've seen what outcomes that has versus a lot of these rural states that decided to stay away from that, to give guidance, but not to lock down. What do you think that should teach people about the differences between that authoritarian approach to governance and one that's more trusting of people?
Well, and that's a good point, although I would suggest that many state governments were too authoritarian. And unfortunately, they did that by following Donald Trump's lead, because he was on stage with Dr. Fauci telling everybody to lock down. And I think we would have had less of that if we didn't have our country's leader suggesting we do that. But yes, if you look at what Cuomo did to New York, I mean, it's appalling, especially the reports about how he may have increased the coronavirus rate. And again, when people ask me why I'm running for president, my answer is because government is too big, too bossy, too nosy, too intrusive. But the worst part is they usually end up hurting the very people they're trying to help. And Cuomo is a perfect example of that. He takes charge so that he can help with the virus, and instead he brings vulnerable people in contact with other people who have the virus. That just shows that government's not working. And you bring up a good point about among the states, because a lot of people ask me, well, what would you do about education? Or what if a state has taxes that are too high? Or what if a state does this? And I say, you know what? Then again, you vote with your feet, you can move to another state. So, and we've seen that. We've seen people leaving California because they've had it with big government. And so at least within states, we have the choice. With the federal government, we don't, which is why it's so important to reduce government influence at the federal level.
There's a lot of different responses to this coronavirus pandemic that make me concerned. I had a conversation about, I want to say in late March, early April, with a libertarian-minded friend of mine in New York. And he was talking about, his concern at the time that people would engage in a lot of violent riotousness that they would, basically behave in a chaotic manner in response to government mandates and lockdowns.
Oh.
And I said that my concern was actually the opposite, that we would prove out to be, too docile, too willing to go along with what we're ordered to do, whether it has any bearing on the right thing to do or not in terms of protecting each other and respecting each other. Why do you think it is that so many Americans, it seems like really until the George Floyd incident set things off, why were they so willing to go along with so many different government mandates that now we know, 2020 hindsight, may not have made a lot of sense?
Well, and I agree with you completely, by the way. And maybe I'm getting my timeline wrong. I thought that, and well, let me mention that at first I was very disappointed and concerned that, maybe Americans had lost their individualistic tendencies that, and by the way, 3 of my grandparents are immigrants. They came to this country for freedom. They wanted to be able to live their own lives. And I was so happy when I saw those, the protests in Michigan against the governor for locking them down and not allowing them to go to their jobs. And I thought, oh yes, we still have our fight in us. There is hope. So I've actually been very hopeful because seeing, the Dallas hairdresser who said, no, I want to go work. And now, by the way, we've seen the other hairdresser in San Francisco with the Nancy Pelosi story. So people are getting fed up and it just feels different. And by the way, I'm thrilled. I'm not sure if you knew this, but about 75% of the volunteers on our campaign are from outside the party. And I think it's because people are seeing this. They are saying, you know what? Does it really make sense in America to lock us up? And the irony here, let me just mention, in addition to that, that one of my grandparents is from Sweden and they came here for freedom. And how ironic that Sweden did not lock down. You could go to schools, restaurants, and shopping. They come here for freedom and then they're under house arrest. It's how sad is that?
I mean, a perfect example of that right now, as you know, is, the vast majority of Europe is reopening for school. Kids are going back into school. Boris Johnson this week, in the UK, saying, of course, we're not going to demand these young children wear masks in the classroom. That's unnecessary, and hearing things like that, when I'm used to, Europe being very authoritarian when it comes to, health related issues and the like, it just really disappoints me. Do you think this is a situation where everything has become so politicized that we can't think necessarily rationally about something like, kids, if they don't have, a pre-existing health problem, have very little to fear from this. Just saying something like that prompts people to say, well, you just want kids to die or something along those lines.
Yes, and the magic word you said was politicized. And I've had a lot of people ask me, why is our country so polarized? Why are we kind of at each other for things like this? And I use education as an example that right now what we have, and by the way, education is a local issue, should be decided among parents, teachers, and students, not the federal government, that the needs of rural Appalachia are much different than the needs of New York City. But in addition to that, even at a local level, I'd like to point out that if, let's say you want to send your kid to a school of prayer and your neighbor doesn't, you've got to battle it out at the ballot box. You've got to donate to each of your candidates. You've got to put yard signs out. You've got to encourage all your friends to vote for your candidate. And one of you is going to win, one of you is going to lose, and you're going to be under one size, one thing that everybody fits. So now we've politicized, your word, education. Under libertarian system, we've with our dollar to quote milk, and we want. So we keep our resources. If you want to send your kid to a school with prayer, you get to. If your neighbor wants to send to his kid to a school without prayer, he gets to. We should each have our own decision making for that. And we have politicized education, retirement, healthcare, wearing masks. I mean, everything now is politicized.
I know that within the context of the school choice debate, there's probably going to be a lot of cascading effects of what we've seen happen this year. As kids are going back to school, they've been scrambling all over each other, families, to try to find private schools that still have an opening. We've seen the number of people who say that they're homeschooling more than double, according to polls. Is this an opportunity, even in kind of trying to find silver linings here, for taking some real steps towards breaking apart a public school system that costs more every year, that spends more and more on each pupil, and that really fails them in terms of preparing them as much as we would like them to be prepared here in America?
Yes, and I hate to put it in terms of a silver lining. However, I think that the coronavirus has brought out the best in a lot of people. And I think it has brought out the hypocrisy that the government has, that people are waking up. And, as long as things are going fine, they don't have reason to look around and want something different. But now with the coronavirus, with the schools, with and I've had some people come, mothers come up and tell me, you know what, it never occurred to me to homeschool my kid until this year. I think that maybe I know better than the government how to raise my kid. And it's the arrogance of the people in DC for them to think that they care more about our children than we do as parents, that the federal government says, I know what's best for your child and you don't. How arrogant.
The approach that has been used by libertarian candidates in the past has varied a lot in terms of the voters that they're targeting. And yes, there's the broad kind of everyone should be interested in these ideas. But culturally, given the kind of conflict that we're in, where everything seems to be an aspect of culture war, there's so little that's left untouched by it. I don't know if you saw the Oscars the other day announcing that they're going to have these quotas now that everybody has to meet in order to be considered for Best Picture. People were pointing out that, The Godfather wouldn't qualify under that category because of it being, overwhelmingly Italian and male.
Yes, and okay, maybe I shouldn't say this because everything is so politically correct.
You're the Libertarian presidential candidate. I think you can say anything you want.
Well, yes, but that means that the media will jump all over me 10 times as hard, whereas, they haven't jumped all over Joe Biden yet. And look what he has said and done. But I remember, and keep in mind, I'm a scientist. I've got a PhD. I understand statistics. And I remember at the Oscars, the So White, and by the way, I just in passing heard the story that you mentioned, so I don't know what the requirements are, but I do remember hearing, seeing the protests in previous years and the Oscar So White, or whatever the saying was, and how disrespectful that we've only got one Black nominee in this category. Well, Blacks comprise 13% of the population. So if the system were fair, then you would expect that 13% of the nominees would be Black. So I'm not, is this like reverse racism again? Is this,
Well,
now,
I think a lot of people are concerned about this. You see what's happening in California, for instance. You may have heard of this, where they're getting rid of some of their measures, inequality type requirements that had been pushed for so many years out there, because they want to be able to discriminate based on race when it comes to certain things. I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court case involving Asian students and the like. It's really concerning.
Oh, very disconcerting. Look at Harvard, as and I guess that's what you're alluding to, where just complete discrimination against Asian students. How is that fair?
Yeah, it's very, I think, uncomfortable for a lot of people today to look at these elements going on and not know how to respond to them. I don't know if you're familiar with the very popular books that have been recommended recently, Caste, recommended by Oprah, The White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and then Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist. I don't know if you've read them, but How to Be Anti-Racist includes this lengthy section in one of his chapters about how capitalism and racism are together, that they're united and that they both need to be destroyed, that to be pro-capitalist is to be pro-racist and to be anti-capitalist is to be anti-racist. That's the kind of accusation that I would normally think of as being just so silly that no American would accept it. Yet these are the books that are being assigned in HR, programs across the country, including ones that are in, in grants and things like that that are coming from the federal government. What can we do to push back against these things that strike me as just so unappreciative of the elements of capitalism that have been at the core of America's success?
Well, I think educate people. And by the way, my book that everybody should read is Animal Farm, where some are more equal than others, because that's what we've got in Washington. And that's what led me to not run for student body president. But what frustrates me is that it's the government that institutionalized racism. And what I've been trying to do is spread the word that, for instance, Rosa Parks, heroic Black woman, refused to sit on the back of the bus. People don't know the rest of the story, which is that that was a government-run, government-owned bus. And at the time, 60% of the bus ridership were Blacks. So we bring that into the free market today. What if Uber discriminated against 60% of their best customers? They would go out of business, as well they should. It's the federal government that doesn't have any accountability. The federal government can discriminate and not go out of business. Nowadays, if you were to discriminate, as in Uber, telling Black, 60% of their best customers, regardless of race, color, creed, whatever, they would go out of business. And if you look at talking about LGBTQ, as recently as 2012, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were both against gay marriage. And yet, in the early 90s, the Disney company was giving benefits to partners of gay employees. So again, we've got the free market doing a much better job, because if the free market doesn't hire the best employees, discriminates against our customers, they go out of business, as well they should. But government, they're immune. And go all the way back to Jim Crow laws.
There's that leads me to kind of a challenge that I think it's difficult for libertarians to come up with a vocabulary around, and that's the concerns on both the right and the left about the increasing power of big corporations over our lives, particularly coming out of Silicon Valley. People aren't used to dealing with big corporations that are essentially very difficult to escape. Something like Google, for example. You can escape Facebook, you don't have to be on Twitter, but something like Google, with everything that it owns, is really such a dominant market force that when they start to go after someone or when there's an issue there, a lot of people get concerned about it. The answer from the left and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders is, effectively break them up, regulate them, or do something along those lines. The answer from the right has mostly been to complain about bias to this point, but we do see some of a push toward in getting rid of some of their regulatory protections or legal protections over certain content and the like. Both seem to be rising as forces on right and left in terms of something that both kind of want to have happen. How do libertarians speak to what I think are some very legitimate concerns on the part of people that these tech corporations are too unified with government, that they have, it's one of the, just to use one example, for instance, is when cell phone information is shared so quickly between, Verizon and the federal government. I think that kind of thing concerns a lot of people who care about civil liberties. And yet these are also members of the marketplace who offer products that people like and use and enjoy and pay for. How can there be some balance found there to speak to those concerns about civil liberties or certain rights that people have without going so far as to say the government needs to step in and either become, a regulatory capture situation there, or that they need to break these things up, which offer much more simple, but I think we both know, not workable answers?
Oh, well, I think it's laughable that Elizabeth Warren says the federal government needs to break it up. First of all, the federal government is the largest monopoly we have. And and I'd love to talk about healthcare, but let me just throw in
Yeah.
real quick. She wants Medicare for all. When I hear her say Medicare for all, what I think is VA hospital for all. Since when do monopolies do a good job? If she's so anti-monopoly, why does she want a monopolistic healthcare system in which if you don't like your doctor, you have no other choice? But we have seen that once again, the free market does a much better job of breaking up monopolies than the government does. And this is the advantage of my being an older candidate. First of all, I do remember Ma Bell being a monopoly. I remember going down to get my phone that I rented because, you know, you didn't buy phones back in those days. And AT&T said, basically, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. So I'd go down and get my black phone because, again, the government regulated it. And when the government stepped back, we did get more competition. But all I need to do is point to IBM. Back in, you know, because I've heard this all before. And I remember having this discussion with the socialist around 1980. And this was when people were talking about the IBM trial, where the government said, you know what, if we, and socialists were saying, you know what, if we break IBM up into 7 equal companies, 7 smaller companies, each company would be the size of boroughs. And a lot of young people are going, okay, what's a boroughs? Well, Burroughs was a major competitor of IBM. And they said, it's not fair. You need the government to break up the monopoly. Well, the reports were that the amount of paperwork generated by the Justice Department, the paperwork supposedly could go to the moon and back, and yet they still weren't able to break up IBM. And guess who broke up IBM? 2 guys in their garage who formed Apple. So once again, the free market does what the federal government can't do. And if you're going to the federal government for help, you are going to the wrong place, because they tend to make things worse. As I said, you know, the reason I'm running for office is they usually end up hurting the very people they're trying to help. They're not the people to go to.
You mentioned healthcare, and obviously healthcare is an area where it seems that neither party has a workable solution. Medicare for all tests well, but then when you also ask people whether they're willing to pay the taxes for it, it polls much worse. And in terms of outcomes, obviously, Medicare is not actually what you would like it to be in terms of what it offers. At the same time, there's such entrenched players in this marketplace. You see the hospital system monopolies, for instance, that dominate states, and then insurers where there's really only 1 or 2 choices in a lot of states in terms of the networks that they have. This is an enormous lift, and everybody who has an existing good plan that they like is scared of losing it if it becomes separated from their employer, a vestige of something that is a New Deal era policy. If in terms of the kind of dramatic change that would need to happen in order to make healthcare in America a free market, do you think that it's just something that looks impossible because of the different players involved and how much they have invested in the current system?
Well, it looks impossible if people like Joe Biden or Donald Trump, remain in office, but it looks possible if you have a libertarian in office. And you mentioned how people are scared of losing their good plans. Even their good plans cost too much.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the system in Singapore, which has a more free market type of system, it costs about $10 for a doctor visit. Here, having open heart surgery or heart bypass costs something like $130,000. Over in Singapore, $18,000. Now, $18,000 is still a lot of money, but a lot of people buy cars for $18,000. So if somehow insurance denied you, you could almost pay for it yourself the way you would pay for a car. So to talk about health insurance, we even have we've shown in our country how a system can work, and that's the state of Indiana, which has a system similar to Singapore. And what they did is they put money into the pockets of their state employees and paid for their catastrophic health insurance. And then they went shopping around. And for instance, before the system started, and by the way, it was voluntary, but quickly everybody joined. Well, not everybody, but quickly a majority of the people joined because they saw how much better of a system it is when it's real insurance. And generic drug use went from about 10% up to 90%. And the best part is they were glad to do it because they got to keep the savings. And that's the way it should be. If you shop for a car or you shop for groceries, you get to keep the savings.
Do you favor a national?
And I can continue. You look like you had a question.
Yeah. Do you favor a national catastrophic insurance coverage plan along the lines of what you're talking about there, where basically they buy insurance on top of that catastrophic coverage, but you achieve kind of a universal catastrophic system?
I'm actually not familiar with that terminology, and to me it doesn't make a lot of sense to buy insurance on top of insurance. I think it makes sense to buy insurance the way we do our car insurance. Mm-hmm. In many states. Now, some states, you know, you can't cross state lines and all that, but the good thing about car insurance and most insurance is that it only pays for unexpected events. And the reason our healthcare costs are so high is because it pays for everything and there's no accountability. So what if your car insurance, for instance, paid for gas, oil, and car washes? You'd have absolutely no reason to shop around for the best gas prices. In fact, you might do the opposite because, you know, you got your little $5 copay card. Sure, go to the nice gas station where you get free coffee while you wait, right? Because it's no skin off of your nose. And the gas stations would have absolutely no reason to compete because they would get paid by the car insurance companies. The car insurance companies are happy to pay the high prices because they simply raise your premiums. And by the way, that's a myth that the insurance companies in healthcare are trying to hold down costs because of course they can't pay every claim. They've got to deny some claims, but the only way that they grow in size is by paying out more claims. So the following year, they can raise premiums to cover those claims and make even more money. So what we have right now is a system as if our car insurance paid for gas and oil. So we have no reason to shop around. Healthcare providers have no reason to compete, and prices go up and up and up. Now, the problem is, and let me make one other quick point. I could spend a whole hour on healthcare. The only two somewhat free market systems that we have in our country are LASIK surgery and cosmetic surgery because we pay for those out of our own pocket instead of the insurance companies. So we do shop around, like when we're shopping around for a car. And the doctors and healthcare providers do advertise and try to beat each other on price. But here's the thing, we are so entrenched, and you brought up a good point, we are so entrenched, or government is so entrenched in the healthcare system, we couldn't just say, okay, overnight, let's go to a free market system because we've got government inflated healthcare costs. We would be, you know, it'd be like throwing us to the lion den to go out there and pay for our own insurance. So we need to start the ball rolling. How I would start the ball rolling is I would put money, just like the state of Indiana does, I would put money in the pockets of veterans. I mean, that's a horrible way to treat veterans with it. It's a horrible, the VA hospital system is a horrible way to treat anybody, especially the people who have served our country. I would put money in the hands of veterans, people on Medicare, people on Medicaid, get the ball rolling with them having people compete on price for them to start getting those prices down so the rest of us can join the system and have the system compete for us the way car manufacturers, car dealerships, computer makers compete on price.
Mm-hmm. There's obviously a lot to talk about within the space of this current moment regarding law enforcement. Over the past couple of years, there was clearly a rise among a lot of law and order minded Republicans to consider both criminal justice reform and prison reform, something that became more a part of their language. But today, you see the kinds of things that happen to a senator like Rand Paul, who literally introduced the Breonna Taylor Act to stop no-knock raids and things like that, getting screamed at by protesters, and images of that nature are only going to make voters, I think, want to have more order and more law enforcement backing in the streets. How can you advance a message on the need for reform of the way that we do policing that is both responsible and doesn't cater to the most extreme leftist, ideas on this subject, where defunding or abolishing police departments is the push of these rioters, really, and protesters in the street?
Well, first of all, let me mention, you make a great point about Rand Paul, because he is on their side more than they realize. And a lot of people don't know about his charity, how he's gone around the world doing eye surgeries for people who can't afford it. I mean, if there's somebody who you should be thankful for, it's Rand Paul's work in getting help to the underserved, the underprivileged. But as far as defunding the police, once again, crime is a local issue, and it should be decided, how to combat it should be decided among police departments, the mayor, voters, taxpayers, city council. Let them decide and keep the federal government out of it. And I think that part of the reason we're here is because the federal government was involved. We see local cop cars where it says to protect and serve and community and all that stuff. And that's how I knew the police growing up. You got the local beat cop who knows you by name. But what we've had instead is the federal government arming, turning police departments into kind of paramilitary groups, giving them free tanks and tear gas and everything else. So now the police have more of an us versus them mentality, and that's not what we want. And here's the worst part, is that we're getting worse protection by spending more money. Because let's say you had a local referendum and it asks you go to the ballot box and it says, okay, would you like your taxes increased so we can buy a tank for our police department? Most people would say, heck no. I'd rather keep that money, maybe go out to a nice restaurant, take a nicer vacation this year instead of not a nice vacation. Let me spend that money in another way. But instead, the federal government takes that money and then dangles it in front of local police departments and, hey, do you want a free tank? Do you want, free training and extra free money? And of course, they're not going to say no. They're going to be sitting there and saying, well, it's our taxpayer dollars. We don't want Alabama or Wyoming to get those tax dollars. So of course we'll take it. So we've got the federal government inserting itself where it doesn't belong. So yes, there was some talk out there about how I had, we're talking about defunding the police, and yes, somebody kind of made a typo, but what I want to do is I want to defund the federal funding of police. As far as the local police, it's whatever the local citizens want to do.
I'm typically in favor of defunding things, but I think people need to dream a little bigger.
Yes.
So, generally speaking.
Oh, and can I mention one other thing too?
Sure.
To your point, which is libertarians in general believe that the government's function should be police, courts, and military. So if there's one thing that should be funded, it's the basic functions of government. Yeah. Not, sending your education dollars to Washington and your healthcare dollars.
There's an element of this that I want to talk about when it relates to President Trump. I feel like one of the things that I hear the most from his supporters who are more libertarian minded, particularly those who might have been in the Tea Party or things like that, is that despite their own frustrations with his big government tendencies, that they believe that he is the only thing essentially preventing a kind of cultural war attack on them and their beliefs. As they've seen the left become more radical, this has become more and more of an issue. They see it in their local public schools where kids get taught the 1619 Project or something like that. They see it in the way that various religious freedom cases play out across the country. And so a lot of people who might describe themselves as libertarian minded essentially believe that while Trump isn't someone I like, or he isn't someone whose big government ideas I agree with, he is at least blocking that. He's blocking these people who want to use government to crush me and crush my, my local religious nonprofit, or, sue the Little Sisters of the Poor, et cetera, et cetera. What do you say to those voters? Because it does seem to me that they have it's difficult to argue with that point, just given that the it's hard to see it's hard to convince them that that's not the case.
Yes, and I completely feel their frustration. I know that many Christians feel as though they're under attack, and I can understand why. Uh, but here's the thing. Trump is still using federal government to go into these issues that he shouldn't, and that's still going to make the problem worse. For instance, education. He's been talking about how the schools need to reopen instead of saying, you know what, you know best how to handle your life. I'm going to stay out of it. In fact, by the way, I'm going to get rid of the Department of Education because you should be able to make your own decisions. So it's kind of like we're battling one idea versus the other instead of saying, you know what, you should be able to make your own decisions. So and I'm not one of these people who are just, orange man bad, because I do realize that he hasn't done everything wrong. Okay, I'll put it that way. But he still is the face of big government. He's still the face of, I'm going to tell you how it should be done instead of giving you the liberties. So yes, a lot of people, for instance, do feel attacked, and I mentioned before, like prayer in school. Okay, well, if you want to have prayer in school and you want to have control over your own culture and you want your values to be passed on, how about Donald Trump, the Department of Education, your tax dollars and giving you back a tiny fraction so that you can carry on your own values? So I don't see, basically it's kind of a battle of the bullies instead of allowing us to vote with our feet or vote with our dollars.
You've been someone within the libertarian movement who really wanted to try to make the party more welcoming to pro-lifers and those who oppose abortion. That's obviously been a split within, I know, prominent libertarians on both sides of that issue. Obviously libertarian-minded Republicans like Rand and Ron Paul and many others, including Thomas Massie and Justin Amash, have been, presented throughout their careers as pro-life. Why do you think it's important for the party to be more open on that ground? And is that itself kind of a representation of how these cultural issues have shifted a little bit in the past couple of decades?
Well, because we're not going to get anywhere if we don't grow. And I think the Libertarian Party in the past has kind of shot itself in the foot by pretty much giving them a test and saying, okay, if you don't agree with us 100%, you can't be in our club. Well, if the club is so small, you're never going to get anywhere. And I would suggest that Ron Paul was a great addition to the Libertarian Party. And I'm so glad that the pro-choice plank didn't scare him away, because we saw how he acted in government. I would love to watch on C-SPAN, and they do the vote totals, and it's the vote is like 423 to 1 or whatever. And I'd always know, oh, that's Ron Paul's vote. Or sometimes it'd be 421 to 2. Oh, there's Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich. And by the way, and I have met Ron Paul several times, and he told me the best story about how he said he was working with other Republicans on some committee, right? And they were talking about whether or not they should increase the spending for this particular project. And the other Republicans he was talking with were saying, but Ron, if we don't increase spending, then we're not going to be reelected. And then what good will we be? Like, are you listening to yourself? So,
that is a very frequent activity in Washington. Right. Yes.
So, I do believe Ron Paul's a voice for liberty, and we just can't scare away voices for liberty. I think he's done a good job to help our cause.
So just with the time that we have left, let's talk a little bit about the brass tacks of politics. Mm-hmm. There's been kind of a split in the way that I would say libertarians view what they're trying to achieve when they run for president. Obviously, you want a situation where the dominoes all break your way in an amazing circumstance. You are able to become president of the United States, but you also are thinking about the future of the party and building a movement, wanting to turn it into something that can represent a larger and larger portion of America, and that can be on the debate stage, can be part of more of the debates that we see playing out across the country. is that possible in a system that seems so skewed to favor a two-party split and against something that would be more of a parliamentary type of system, or one where you would actually have kind of a representative group of parties? When AOC says she doesn't feel like she belongs to the same party as Joe Biden, I agree with her, and I think that she's basically right, but because of the system we have, that's the lineup that we're given. How can you break that open a bit with your run?
Well, we're trying to do it with social media. We're trying to do it with my going around the country. I think, unlike Joe Biden, I'm not locked up in my basement. I'm here in beautiful Alaska. And I think I'm scheduled to be going to 46 states. In fact, we're sitting here thinking, you know what? We're so close to 50, let's make it 50. But I'd like to point out that we are making progress, that pretty much from the beginning of our campaign, about 75% of our volunteers are from outside the party. So my welcoming nature has been working. People are, they're not saying, well, I'm not a perfect libertarian, so I guess I have to vote for Joe Biden. And that's what's so frustrating. People like Justin Amash, and I did run against him, of course, for the nomination, but I hope people notice, not once did I criticize his views, his issues, saying he wasn't libertarian enough. Hey, he belongs in the Libertarian Party more than he belongs in the Democratic and Republican parties. So do Lincoln Chafee, Bill Weld, and all these other people who really, are kind of floating out there. So we need to grow the movement, and we are. And a lot of people are saying, I've had it with the two older parties. And we keep hearing the media refer to it as two old rich white guys. Of course, I'd like to add the fact that's not even the most important part. The most important part is they both want to spend your money. They both think that they make decisions for your life better than you do. Neither one want to bring the troops home. So we don't have a real choice up there. And I think the fact that when people looking at the demographics, I think that it's kind of highlighting that there really isn't as much of a difference. And so I'm so thrilled that we have so many people joining the campaign. And so many times I hear people say, wow, I didn't even know I had a choice. And by the way, I'm on 49 states plus Washington, DC. So it looks like, our goal is that every American has a real choice to vote for themselves, and not big government.
I'm going to ask you one last question. It seems to me that one of the reactions that happened to Donald Trump as a candidate that followed him into the presidency is a total rejection of anything that he says that is critical of an assumption of the aggressive and dominant use of military power everywhere around the world. He got so much blowback for it as a candidate. He got even more blowback for it, I would argue, as president. It's been constant in terms of the attacks, the leaks, and the rare instances where he has deployed aggressive military power, launching a couple of missiles, out there. Oh, this is the week he became presidential, from the perspective of the national media.
Oh.
Given the fact that polling shows us that Americans overwhelmingly want a smaller footprint overseas, regardless of their personal ideology, that they're tired of these wars that have gone under both Democratic and Republican presidents. Why do you think it is that still on the national scene, the assumption on the part of the media is war is good, you should be involved everywhere, we have to be everywhere that we want to be, we have to be everywhere even if the American people don't want us to be there, and that anyone who criticizes that or goes against it, not just Trump, but really anyone, Tulsi Gabbard, Thomas Massey, the like, yes, that they're engaged in irresponsible, anti-American, they get accused basically of being Russian stooges and the like, just because that they don't want as many troops spread out everywhere. Tell me what can be done to change that, if anything, because it seems insurmountable to me.
Yeah, well, first of all, one of your questions is, why do the media keep putting that out? And I'd like to point out my PhD is in industrial organizational psychology, not clinical psychology. I couldn't even begin to dissect why they think the way they do. It makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. But you're right. But I think there's still, I think there's beginning to be a sense out there that people realize that Tulsi Gabbard was muzzled by the Democratic machine, and they're not happy about it. And when I talk to veterans, they tell me that, you know, they've seen things that nobody should ever see, and we need to do something about it. So I'm hoping through social media, I'm hoping by my campaign that we can just bring it about. And one thing that I've been pointing out to people is, you know, because if nothing else, people are hit in the pocketbook. You know, people care about the money in their back pocket. And what I've been telling people is on the campaign trail is, you know, we keep hearing how great France is because they've got 5-week vacations. Well, yeah, maybe we could have 5-week vacations too if we didn't have to pay for their military. How about we cut 2/3 of our military budget, pay for our own military, turn America into one giant Switzerland, armed and neutral, and protect our borders, and let them pay for their own. And I think people kind of understand a sense of fairness. So it just has to be sold right. But you're absolutely right. The media, of course, is never, well, I shouldn't say never. I've actually gotten good media in Alaska. So we're just trying to break through that media barrier.
That's where you have to go to find good media
Yes,
these days.
yes. Yeah, people wonder. And in fact, I've been asked, why are you in Alaska? Isn't that expensive? Why aren't you down there? Well, Alaska, oh gosh, they exemplify the libertarian spirit. You know, rugged individualism. I'm so happy to be here. And they have been very welcoming. And yeah, it's in my Alaska Voters Guide, I wrote that Alaska is 3,000 miles away from Washington, D.C., but it can sure seem like a lot farther the way they're voting.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Joe. Where are you headed next?
Oh, it's my honor. Thank you so much. Well, in a little over a week, we'll be on another leg of our bus tour. We only planned on doing one bus tour, but it was so successful, we're doing another one. So in a little over a week, I am going to Idaho, I believe. It's just like, if this is Tuesday, it must be Belgium. You're too young to understand that reference. But I get on this bus and I go from city to city. So we're starting out in the West.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and good luck to you.
Oh, my honor. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.